Hey everyone, welcome back to part 4. Like I said last time, this one's focusing on us making a really cool system that makes it a lot easier for us to make a bunch of different weapons with a bunch of different qualities. It makes it easier for us to organize them and be able to edit them and do what we need to with them. And then I also show you how to swap between the weapons and stuff like that. So yeah, this one's a pretty important addition to the last video, so pay close attention. And not just because of that, but because we're learning some cool new concepts in this one and some things that are very, very useful for any kind of scenario in any kind of game that you might want to make. So yeah, good luck. Okay, so let's talk about structs and constructors. I've covered this in a couple other videos. Covered it in my item inventory video, as well as my saving and loading video, both of which probably need some updates. But they both do a pretty decent job of explaining what structs and constructors are. Once again, I'm going to go through it a lot faster in this video than I would in those other two. Point being, watch the item inventory video to really understand what structs and constructors are. So yeah, again, if you find yourself getting lost in this next part, I'm going a little too fast, go check that out. It'll help you out a bunch and you can come right back here. So yeah, anyways, the basics. A struct is kind of like an object where you can it can hold a bunch of its own variables, and those variables can be used and manipulated. Unlike an object, they can't do things like they can't draw themselves, they don't run step events or anything like that. It's basically just like a very, very lightweight object. So what we're going to do is we are going to create structs that store information for our weapons. And then we're going to kind of abstract that out into a constructor, and a constructor is kind of like a template for structs. But anyways, let's just start with a struct. So to create a struct, it's going to look like this, and actually I'll put it under here. We're going to create this first one in the player object just so we can see what's up. So we're going to call this struct weapon. We're just going to call it weapon. And set a struct, you set it equal to curly brackets like this. So you're telling GameMaker that this is not just a variable, it is a struct which can hold its own variables. So in here I could set stuff like, you know, the player has an X and Y. However, weapon can also have an X and Y. So like if I just set them like this, if I said X of weapon equals 0, then it has that. I could say Y equals 0. I could set anything. This thing could have its own shoot timer and set that to 0. And all of these belong to weapon. They don't belong to the object player. So if I wanted to reference one of these, I could say like weapon dot shoot timer, and that would return 0. It wouldn't be returning the players, it would be returning weapons. So in weapon, we can set some variables for information that we would want from each weapon. And we would do that like this. You set it like a variable, use a colon, set it to whatever you want it to be, and then you separate everything out with a comma. So we're gonna want things like a sprite for our weapon, right? And for our default one, we said that's going to be S blue rod. And then we can go ahead and put the comma there for fun. So let's show this off working. Let's go into our draw event and then back into draw my weapon. And so now, instead of just straight up drawing this sprite, we can draw our weapon dot sprite like this. And this will give us the same result. So if I run the game, it's working exactly the same as it was before. Perfect. So go ahead and do this. Change this to weapon.sprite. And now we need to think of some other information that would vary from weapon to weapon. If we go back to our create event here, we already have two pieces of information. We have the length of our weapon and the bullet object that goes with it. So we can make a new thing called just length, so it's not too long, but that'll be the same as our weapon length. So I'm going to cut this out with Control X and paste it here, right? So now we don't need to use weapon length anymore. Now we can use weapon.length. So let's go find where we used our weapon length. That would have been where we were creating the bullet, right? Right here. It's giving us an error right now. It's saying we're trying to use an unassigned variable, which is true because I just got rid of it. So let's change that to weapon.length. Oh, and a quick thing to note is certain variable names, when using them in structs, when you re-reference them, they'll highlight in red. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not 100% sure what the reasoning for that is. Like I know .name would be another one if you set a variable called name in your weapon. I haven't actually noticed them doing anything different at all. There are some variables that you can't use in structs, but the ones you can't use are things like the big global built-in variables. So you couldn't use like FPS, since that's a built-in, or FPS real, or something like that. Or you can't use true or false or things like that. So sometimes the red, I haven't noticed it do anything weird to any of my projects ever. So yeah, just don't worry about it too much. So anyways, let's use weapon.length again. And these are the only two places where we used the original weapon length variable. So once again, let's run the game and just make sure everything's working fine. It is. Okay, we're getting everything cool again. Everything's still cool. Exit out of there. We can do the same thing with bullet object down here. So let's go back to the create and let's add bullet object as one. I'm gonna say that's O blue bullet again. So let's get rid of that and make sure we go back into the step event, and we need to change this to weapon.bulletObject. Make sure that it's the correct name. If you changed the name whenever you changed it in the struct of weapon here, you need to make sure it matches. And with all these, you need to make sure you're accessing it from weapon, so weapon.bulletObject. Let's check one more time, make sure it's working, and it's still working. Okay, great. So what's maybe one more thing that we would want to have change based on our weapon? We talked about it a bunch already, cooldown time. So we can also add that into our struct, and I'm just going to change its name to just cooldown. Set that to 9, and I'm changing it to just cooldown because we're going to have to be doing weapon.cooldown, and weapon.shoot cooldown would just be a really, really long thing to have there. You can keep it the same if you want, but remember, it has to match in your struct, okay? We're getting rid of this now over here, and now we're using the weapon.cooldown, so let's go and change it. So instead of shoot timer equaling shot cooldown, weapon.cooldown, and let's test and make sure it works again. Okay, everything is working totally fine, just how it was before. So aside from that giving you a little test just to make sure we could rename some variables and find where they are and replace them properly, that's good practice to have, by the way, in case you need to do something like that. Now we have just stored this all in a struct and the game seems to be completely the same. Well, let's think about it this way. Everything that we're referencing is from the struct called weapon, right? Well, what if we did this? Then what if we made this name a little bit more specific? I'm going to call this blue rod. So now this struct called blue rod is containing all the information with the blue rod weapon, right? Now I can just say weapon equals blue rod. So now weapon is now a totally identical struct to blue rod because we've set it equal to it. And let's just prove that really quick. Let's just run the game. And even though we changed the name of this, because we set it to weapon, everything that is reading from weapon, like the sprite, the length, and the bullet object, it should all be working fine again. So let's test one more time. And look at that, everything is still working fine. And now maybe you can kind of see where we're going with this. So I can make a bunch of different structs of these weapons. And then the way we would just swap between them is, say we had a yellow rod weapon that was like this. We'll say, watch, I'm just going to copy and paste this really quick. I'm going to call this, or I'll call it slow rod, because we're still going to use the blue rod sprite, but maybe the cooldown is like, maybe the cooldown is like 30 entire frames, half a second, way longer. So now if I switch my weapon to slow rod, let's run the game and see what happens. Yeah, see that? Much slower. Now a lot of the information looks identical, but technically this is an entirely different gun. It just also is blue, but it shoots slower. So now we know what we want to do with our template, but who knows, down the line we might want to add different information to it. What if we wanted to add the number of bullets that are shot every time? What if we wanted to add some variables for visual effects? And going back to the number of bullets, if we had a number of bullets, we would kind of want to maybe factor in like the spread, angle-wise of the bullets, right? So we could potentially add a bunch of stuff to this, and that's when it helps to have a constructor. Constructor looks very similar to a struct, except it's in like a function form, kind of like whenever we made our custom function over here. So we can create a constructor function that helps us make these weapons. So let's get rid of my slow rod. We don't need that right now. I want to start making more weapons, which means I want to make a constructor, and I want to organize them all in a place that makes sense. So like I said, constructors are functions pretty much, and so let's do what we did before and put them in their own script. Now I'm going to create a separate script, so right click, create script, and I'm going to call this weapon creation. Should be pretty self-explanatory, all right? And let's get rid of the default stuff they have in there and create our constructor. So say constructor template for weapons constructor. And here's how we create one of those. So it's a function. So we're going to tell GameMaker it's a function. We're going to name it. I'm going to name this, I'm going to name it create weapon. We're going to do our parentheses for letting GameMaker know that, yes, this is in fact a function, because we're also going to be putting our own arguments in there. And then we're going to use the keyword constructor, which I just realized I misspelled up here, even though I thought I fixed it. Okay. Then, just like the draw my weapon function, we're going to open up some curly brackets so we can do some stuff. Now, constructors work a very specific way. They take input arguments up here, just like a normal function, like how something like place meeting takes an X and it takes a Y and it takes an object. We need to pass through certain arguments that we need to create our structs based on this, right? And they're saved up here as local variables, basically. So I'm going to use the naming convention that I normally use for them, which is an underscore. And then we're just going to use the arguments that we wanted. So first I wanted a sprite, right? And if you check down here, we have create weapon highlighted, and just like a built-in function, it's showing us what the arguments are supposed to be. So the first one is going to be the sprite that we want it to be. Our second one was the length of the weapon. Again, if we click down here, it's filling out. It says length. If you want it to be a little bit more clear for you, you can change this to weapon length or something like that. So it shows up down here so you know more what it's talking about. That doesn't really matter. The more important part for these arguments is that they're readable to you down here, that you know what they mean, because you'll see how we're setting them in a second. So we had weapon length, we had our bullet object, and we had our cooldown. So yeah, these were the four that we already had in our struct. So now here is how we're going to be actually setting those variables. So we need to type the variables with their correct names, which was just sprite, length, bullet object, and cooldown. And we need to set them to the arguments that we're going to be passing in. So say sprite equals sprite, like this. And then you want to separate it out with a semicolon, how you would in normal code, but it's more important to make sure you actually have your semicolon here in constructors. It's an important part of them. So then we go down to the next line. We want to set our length to whatever we called that second argument, which I just called weapon length. Same with our bullet object. So bullet object equals bullet object. And our cooldown equals cooldown. Easy. So now we can use this constructor to make new structs with this template that contain all this information. So let's recreate this blue rod struct using the create weapon constructor. And I'm not going to delete this one yet. I'm just going to do it right above it so we can just see the difference. So to create a struct from constructor, we're going to say blue rod equals, we're going to use the keyword new, and then we're going to call create weapon like this. So now GameMaker knows that we're making a new struct from the create weapon structor. And then we need our parentheses here so we can pass in stuff like our sprite, our weapon length, our bullet object, or our cooldown. We could do this totally like a normal function would look. So we can go ahead and have S blue rod right here. We could put this big lengthy function right here, and then we could continue on going this way. However, you saw that, it can get pretty long, especially if you're calculating the length in this way. What you can also do is you can actually separate this out into multiple lines. So GameMaker will always keep reading everything between these parentheses. You see how they're highlighted like this? If I click to the left of this one or the left of this one, they highlight each other. Even if I separate them out in this way, you can see that they're still being read as one. So I can just continue filling out create weapon on each individual line like this. So for the length, I wanted this information right here. So under weapon length, that's there. I still need a comma to separate them, and then go to the next argument, which is asking for what kind of bullet object do I want, and that's O blue bullet, separated out with a comma again. And then we have the cooldown, which was 9 frames. So yeah, they look pretty similar. However, you can see just a couple immediate advantages, which is whenever we're using a constructor, it tells us on the bottom what all we need to fill out. Anytime we have that specific section highlighted, it'll tell us exactly what we need to be doing. And we don't have to type out the variable names every single time, and it makes sure that any new weapons that we create using this function will all be completely uniform with one another. If I were to add more arguments to create weapon over here, it would always show up anytime we would highlight it that we needed more arguments, and it would tell us which ones we needed. And whenever you set up functions like this, you can actually set up default values for arguments. So I could say the default value should be the sprite blue rod. And you see now when create weapon is highlighted, sprite is in brackets here. And that means I don't actually have to input any information for this first argument because it has a default value. If I were to input a different sprite here, then it would change it to the new thing that I specified. But if I left it blank, then it would just automatically go with the blue rod. And I could just put in a default value for weapon length as just some number. I'll just go ahead and make it 0. It doesn't really matter because I'm always going to want to set it regardless. But if you put these default arguments in, so like object blue bullet, and we'll say the default cooldown is just 1 or something like that. That means anytime you need to add new arguments to create weapon or something like that, if you fill in these default values, then you're never going to get an error of missing information, if you see what I mean. So just to show you, all this is working completely identically to how it would over here. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the old blue rod because now I have my new one. I'm going to make sure the weapon is actually set to my blue rod before I actually run it because slow rod doesn't exist anymore. And now I'm just going to test it and make sure everything is still running exactly how it should. And look at that, it is. Now hopefully you didn't run into any issues on the way since we did a lot of testing on each step, but this last one was probably the biggest step. So again, remember this is how you have to set it up. You have to say function, type in what you want your constructor to be called, and then on the outside of the parentheses here, you need to type constructor, have your curly brackets, you have to have the semicolons here. That's just how it works. Make sure you didn't accidentally put any semicolons up here because I've done that before where my brain just says, oh, if I said something equals something, I need to put a semicolon at the end. No, I mean, it should give you an error and it should tell you. So yeah, it'll tell you that there's a problem wrong here and it says that it got a semicolon when it wasn't supposed to. So, you know, there's always a bunch of little places to go wrong, but if you're still having trouble, just go back a little bit in the video because we kind of need to pick up the speed soon. Got a lot to cover. So I'm going to make another weapon, another actual weapon. I'm going to make a yellow rod this time. So I'm just going to add in some assets and I'll walk through all those in a second when I come back. Okay, so here you see I have a totally identical just yellow rod because I'm a little lazy. But just remember when you make a new weapon, if you want to make it look very different, to make sure the collision mask goes to the end of where you want the actual bullet to shoot out. Remember, its origin needs to be in the right place, all that stuff. And then I have a little yellow bullet, which is just a thin little skinny guy. And this guy's gonna be faster than the blue guy, is what I've decided. So really, the two ways to change the behavior of the weapons and the bullets is one, to change the actual bullet object itself, and two, to change the cooldown time in our weapon struct, right? So first things first, the big change is gonna have to come from our new type of bullet. So I'm gonna make a new one. I'm gonna create an object. I'm gonna call it O yellow bullet, set its sprite to be the yellow bullet sprite. And we already did so much work with our blue bullet, and it would be foolish to just redo it again. So I'm gonna use the parenting system again, but this time we're gonna be able to do a little bit more with it. So I'm gonna go into my parent tab and select the blue bullet as the parent of the yellow bullet, since the blue bullet is kind of gonna be the default one. As you see here, it filled in with these little like phantom events. And like I said, children object inherit all the qualities of their parent objects by default. So if I were to just plop this in, then it would basically be the same as a blue bullet, but with the yellow bullet sprite. So before we, even mess with it, let's just go ahead and prove that. Why don't we, huh? Okay, so let's go back in my player. Let's make the yellow rod. So that needs to be a new, create weapon, tab these out, give them some room. Okay, so again, we can check at the bottom here. Tells us exactly what we need. So I want my yellow rod. Oh, I named it something different in my other file. Okay, I'm gonna change this to the S yellow rod just to keep everything all consistent. Okay, so we want my sprite for my yellow rod. Oh my gosh. I want to do the same thing up here for the weapon length offset. So I'm actually just going to be a little cheater here, and I'm just going to copy and paste that because it's a lot. But you do need to remember to change this to the correct sprite that you're using. So that's all good for the weapon length. Then what object do I want to use? Well, I want to use a yellow bullet, and for cooldown I want it to be shorter because I want them to shoot faster. So let's say 3. Only 3 frames in between each one can be shot. And now let's change my weapon to the yellow rod. Let's give it a go. Okay, looking good so far. The yellow rod's working, and that's right. Okay, so I'm rapid fire shooting these new yellow bullets. As you can see, they're behaving exactly like the blue ones. So they're going the same speed, but they're just shooting faster because we changed the cooldown time, which is an improvement. But there's obviously a couple things. One, I want these to go a little bit faster just to make them a little bit more different. And I want them to actually have the correct orientation. It looks kind of weird. It almost looks like a weird like sci-fi weapon if they all just stay horizontal like that. So that could be cool. If you made them super wide, then this could be a good weapon to shoot up and down, but not necessarily side to side. Anyways, so let's just change those two things. And let's say we want them to go farther too. So we can change all that easy peasy. So let's go into our yellow bullet object again and change some things. How do we do that with a child object? Simple. You can right click on the event that it is inheriting currently. And if you click on inherit event, it will do this. It will create a new event for you, and it will automatically be calling this function in event inherited, which does exactly what it's saying it does right here. It means that all the creation code in the parents event happens right here on this one line. So we can put that at the very top, inherit the parent event. And now that means that since all that is already run, we can change any info that we want to change for this bullet. So let's say change properties. And like I said, I wanted the speed to be higher. So the speed for our blue object was 5, I believe. If I want to check, I can right click on my create event and then go to show parent event. And it will open up this tab of what the blue bullet's parent is. So yeah, our default speed is 5. So I can change the default speed to 8 if I want. And not only that, I said I wanted it to go farther too. So the max distance here is 240. Well, maybe I want the max distance to be 400 for this guy. So now it's exactly the same object as the blue bullet, except it has these new different properties on top of it, which makes it behave differently, which is really cool. The one other thing that we wanted to do was make sure that it was going the correct orientation, right? Well, because I already made it like flat, going left and right, it's technically already rotated to 0 degrees, right? So that means its rotation just needs to match the direction that it's going in. So we can do that in the step event. So we'll do the same thing. We're going to right click. I'm going to inherit the original step event from the blue bullet because we want it to still collide with things and move. And now I can just use the built-in variable called image angle, which is, again, self-explanatory. It's the angle at which this image is shown at. Its default is always 0, but I'm going to set its angle to the direction that it's moving at. So now it should turn with whichever direction it's moving. So let's run the game, and look at that. It's facing the right direction, they're going faster, and they're going farther. Yeah, way farther. Look at that. That's pretty cool, methinks. So now we have a whole other weapon made. And it was that easy. We just had to change a couple things, make a new struct in our player, and now I could swap them like this. Now, obviously, what we want to be able to do is swap them in the game while we're playing. But before we do that, I'm gonna take our structs and constructors to just one more level. We're gonna do one more thing, okay? Just a quick explanation. Right now, our blue rod and our yellow rod belong to object player. So if I wanted to reference blue rod or yellow rod anywhere else, it'd have to be like, oh, player dot blue rod dot sprite if I wanted to get the sprite of the blue rod. This isn't great because this also means that the player has to exist, that the player has to be in the room, otherwise no other object can reference it. And not only that, it means when the game is compiling, if you want certain objects to reference these weapons for whatever reason, it means they just can't because the player hasn't set them yet. So again, where's the place that we want to set things that the rest of the game can reference at any time and knows what we're talking about? Yes, the scripts. Inside the scripts. Same reason we made draw my weapon in a script, and the same reason we made create weapon in a script. So we're actually going to move these into that weapon creation script. And then we're going to store them inside of another struct. Yeah, so let's just go ahead and move them first. So I'm going to copy these two weapons that we've made and go back into my weapon creation and go under here and call these the weapons. So I'm going to remake everything look nice. So because these blue variables here mean that they are not global in scope, nothing can reference these by themselves, right? Because there's no way to access them whenever they're just created in a script by themselves. So one of the ways you would want to go around that is you could say something like global dot blue rod. And so now this is a global struct, and anything could reference global dot blue rod. Same with the yellow rod, but we could take it one step further. We could create an outer global struct that contains all of these weapons in it. And it would just make it a really clean and easy way to reference all of these weapons without creating a ton of global variables. So, quick recap on how a struct not made from a constructor looks. So if I wanted to make a global struct, I would do global dot, and then whatever I wanted to call it. I'm going to call this weapon list with a capital W, and you're going to set that equal to some curly brackets. And then remember, when setting things inside of a struct, you want to use colons and commas. So, for example, we're not going to do the whole struct yet, but say, blue rod equals, say, 4, right? So blue rod colon 4. So if we wanted to add our actual blue rod into here, it would look very similar to how we have it here. So I'm going to plop it in and tab this out. However, it shouldn't be blue rod equals this new script. It needs to be blue rod colon this new script. And then after our parentheses here, I'm going to put a comma. So that way I can add new things under it. And I would do the same with the yellow rod. Again, there needs to be this comma here so they're actually separated out, but put yellow rod here and make sure that you have yourself a colon and another comma so you can add more weapons. So now I can go ahead and get rid of these, and anywhere else in the game at all, I could say global weapon list and then dot blue rod, or blue rod, the way it's actually spelled. And if I did that, now anything in the game would know that I was talking about this weapon right here. So as we did every step of the way everywhere else, let's check and make sure that this is actually going to work. So I'm going to go into my player object. If you're nervous and you don't want to get rid of these yet, here's a cool little trick. If you type in a / and a star, it turns everything past that / and a star into a comment until you just get to a star and a /. And now everything in between here is technically a comment. So it's not running code anymore. So if you're too scared to delete something and scared you might have to Control Z and something might go wrong, don't worry, you can keep this here. But now we can check our weapon and go with global.weapon list, and let's try blue rod first. So we're going to try the blue rod. It should just work exactly the same. Nothing should have changed. Yep, working exactly the same. And don't really need to test it, but I'm going to test yellow rod one more time just to make sure. All right, perfect. Perfect. I'm going to get rid of these. And if everything's been fine up to this point, but you just had an issue with this, go back into your weapon creation script and check and make sure you formatted it right. Remember, this needs to be global.weapon list. It needs to be equal to the curly brackets. And then whenever you're making these new constructors, they need to be set with a colon, and there needs to be commas in between them. There's a lot of things to remember, but now whenever you're making new weapons, you have the exact blueprint right here every single time. I could just go down and I could make a red rod and just set that to a new create weapon and just do it in the exact same format that I see right above me. And the constructor will take care of all of this for me and make sure that I'm not missing any information. And if I do, it gives me a little safety net. And my weapon list is just keeping it all nice and organized. One other issue you might have is just make sure that you're spelling weapon list the same way. So go back in your player object. Like I said, because this is the global variable, I gave it a capital W at first. So capital weapon, capital list. And you can always find it by typing in your global variable and then start typing it in. And even if it's not case sensitive, it will autofill down here for you as the correct version. So you can click on your global variable there and make sure that's spelled the right way. So now our structs and our constructors are beautiful. And now we just need to move on to actually swapping our weapons in gameplay, which is going to be super easy and super fast. Okay, so to start off with our weapon swapping stuff, the first thing that we want to do is have a list of the weapons that we can actually swap between. So in other words, basically like a weapon inventory. In this series, we're not going to go too crazy with HUD stuff or menu systems or anything like that, just because that would absolutely balloon the length of this series to a ridiculous degree. And I've already done stuff like my item inventory video, which should be pretty applicable to this. I've done the menu system video. So this is just going to be doing a lot of the programming behind it. And basically what we're going to do is we have our weapon list here, which is all the available weapons that we just did. But now we're going to make a weapon inventory, which is which ones the player actually has picked up or bought or whatever. So we're going to do that with an array, just like these up here. And there's a bunch of cool functions in GameMaker that let us add and remove things from arrays. So it's a really good way to keep track of like a list of something, and it's really easy to use. Now, first off, something like your weapon inventory or an item inventory is going to be pretty important information for other parts of the game to have, not just the player. Because I can imagine if you put in some kind of shop system or some kind of room where you pick up a single upgrade or something like that, those systems need to know which weapons that the player already has in their inventory. And you could also just have weapons be pickups or something like that. And it could be pretty useful information for those to know what weapons the player already had if you don't want to litter the game with useless pickups for the player. Ergo, a weapon they already have. So we are just going to do a simple array, but we're going to make this a global array. Just like how weapon list is global, that way it'll make all the stuff I just mentioned a lot easier, and it should make saving the game a lot easier. And I have a saving and loading tutorial on this channel as well, so you'll be able to add that onto this project once these videos are done. So let's go do that. Okay, so this is going to be really easy. First, where do we need to declare our global weapon inventory? Well, as I mentioned before, scripts are really good for this, and we've used it a bunch of times, so let's just do this in our weapon creation script. We set our global weapon list here at the beginning of the game, so everything else referencing it could know what it was. So we can do the same thing with our weapon inventory, or player weapons, or whatever. So I'm going to say this is the player's weapon inventory. And we can do that like this. So global dot, and then we can name it. You can either call this weapon inventory, or maybe just to make it look different than weapon list, I might just call it player weapons, like that. So like I said, this is going to be an array. And like I said, you can either create an array by doing something like this. So setting the first entry to whatever you want to set it to, or you can actually use the function array create. And basically, this function creates an array and returns it. So you can set it to a variable. And the argument that it takes is just asking how large this array should be, what size. And with this, we can actually say 0. We can actually just create an array that has no entries at all, which is what we want right now, because then we can add some entries with other functions anywhere else in the game. So yeah, and you can see here there's a second argument down here that's in brackets, which means it's optional, that says value. And this just means if I were to make an array with multiple entries, so say I made an array with 10 entries, like I said, all their default values to be some value. So they could all be 1. So player weapons 0 through 9 in the array would all equal 1, and it would all be filled out already. I believe at default it would just fill in all zeros, but it doesn't really matter whenever we're creating a totally empty array. So good, now that we have it, we can start adding some weapons to it. So let's go back to the player. Let's come down one and say add weapons to player weapon inv. And so here's one of those cool functions that work for arrays, and it's called array push. And this is cool because what it does is you input any array that you have, just like the one we made. So our global dot player weapons, and then you can add any value you want to that array, and it just pushes it into the next available position. So since our array is empty, it would push it to the first entry. If our array had like 5 entries in it, it would push it to the 6th one. You get the idea. So the value we can push is we can push in our, let's say our blue rod. So global.weaponlist.blue rod. And so now we can set our weapon based on our player's weapons here. And remember, it's an array. Weapon equals global.player weapons and the very first entry, which is 0, which would now be the blue rod. So if we were to run the game, you see that my player is using the blue rod. It's all working fine. So that works. And instead of swapping out blue rod with yellow rod to test it, we can actually add yellow rod just to the list really quick. So let's do that. So global.player weapons, and we're adding global weapon dot yellow rod. So now we're pushing another entry, which means that player weapons entry number 1 is the yellow rod and 0 is still the blue rod. So let's see if that works. And great, look at that. So now you can kind of see we're going to be doing what we did with our sprites. Remember how we use this face variable to plug in to our sprite array to make sure that we were dynamically getting the right information for our walk cycles? We're going to be doing the exact same thing with this array here. So we need a variable like face that will plug into our player weapons array. And I'm going to call that selected weapon. And I'll just default set it equal to 0. So if I were to put selected weapon in here, now we would be getting the blue rod. And if it were to be 1, we would get the yellow rod. So cool. Now the only thing we need to do is just kind of cycle through the weapons with some kind of button press or some kind of command, and then set the weapon just like this in our step event. Right before we do that, one last little note about this little section here. We just happen to be doing this in the player object, adding to the player weapon arrays, but this can be done anywhere. This could be done with any pickup item, any shop system, anything like that. You could put it in the create event of somewhere else. Should be able to just put this at the bottom of weapon creation as long as you put it like down here, because remember, you have to be able to read from weapon list, so you can't do it before weapon list is set, but you should be able to put it down here. You can do it anywhere because these are all global. So we're just doing it in the player right now because it's the easiest, but it can be done anywhere. And one more thing to note, just as another thing about the array push function, is you don't actually have to do it on these 2 lines like I did. If you want to set a whole bunch of things at once, you can actually just keep adding values to array push like that. And, you know, but normally you're probably only going to be doing it one at a time, like I said, with shop systems or pickups or whatever. But if at the beginning of the game you want your player to have 2 different weapons, you can just set both of them like this. So if I were to set it to 1, that would still be our yellow rod. Okay, so let's actually work on the swapping now. So for that, we need to go into our step event. And the first thing we need to do is come up with a weapon swap button. Now, the way I'm going to do this is, no matter how big the list of the weapons are, I want to do it to where the right mouse button will just go to the next one in the list, and then it'll just cycle through going forwards and then loop back around. But you could do this in a million different ways. But I like how simple and fast this is. So that's what I'm going to do. So I can call this swap key, and I'm going to call this swap key pressed, because we're going to use the mouse check button pressed function this time, because we only want to swap a weapon the moment a button is pressed. We don't want it to swap every single frame that the button is being held down. So if you guessed, that will be MB right for mouse button right. You'd be correct. And now we have a button that checks for our right mouse button press. Easy. So if you want to make this like E or F or something like that, you totally could. You just have to use the ORD function here. But with this game, I think it's nice to be able to keep your left hand on the arrow keys at all time. Okay, so I say we probably want to do the weapon swapping before we do the shooting. It wouldn't make a massive difference, but might as well do it right before, so that way you could have frame perfect bullet shooting. So like I said, it isn't going to make much of a difference regardless, but we can do it here anyways. So just going to make a little bit of space, just separate it out and say weapon swapping. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to store our player's weapon list in a local variable, which is something you can do. So we're going to do that like this. And basically the only reason we do this is constantly referencing a global variable multiple times isn't quite as easy for GameMaker as referencing a variable that belongs to its own object, or especially when it comes to referencing a local variable. For most pixel art games with low resolution, it's not going to make a huge deal of difference anyways, but it's good to get into better habits as soon as you can. So anytime you know you need to be referencing something global a bunch of times in like a step event, or especially like a draw event or something like that, if you just need to read its data, then first storing it inside of a local variable and then referencing that local variable will be a lot easier on GameMaker trying to run your game. So we've got that. I'm going to tab these out so we know they're under weapon swapping. And now I'm going to say cycle through weapons. We're going to do that at the swap key press. So we're going to say if swap key pressed, then we're going to run this code in here. And the first thing we want to do is increase this selected weapon value. So first we're going to say change the selection and wrap around. So first we need to add to our selected weapon variable. So we can do that with just, you could say either say plus equals 1 or just plus plus, which is the same thing. And before we do the wraparound, let's do this next line just so we can see why the wraparound is important, because then we're going to set the new weapon. We're going to do that like we did in the create event, except obviously we don't need to use the global variable here. We just need to use the local variable that we made, so we can say weapon equals player weapons, and that's of our selected weapon. So this will cycle through our list of weapons. However, the reason I wrote we need to do a wraparound here is because, for example, currently our global.playerWeapons is only 2 entries deep. Got the blue rod in position 0 and the yellow rod in entry 1. So if selected weapon goes over 1 and it goes to 2, this is going to crash our game and it's going to give us an error, because we're going to be trying to access an entry in our player weapon array that doesn't exist. So we need to make sure if our selected weapon goes over the size of our list, then it wraps back around to 0. We can do that like this. We can say if selected weapon is greater than or equal to the array length of our player weapons, then we can set selected weapon back to 0. And array length does exactly what it sounds like. It returns the length of a certain array, which means how many entries there are in it. So array length of our player weapons right now is going to be 2 because there are 2 entries in it. So even though arrays start at 0, that first 0 entry is still an entry. So we have the first entry and the second one. So that's why we're doing greater than or equal to the array length. So hopefully all that makes sense for you. So now in our case, if our selected weapon is equal to or greater than the number 2, then we just set it back to 0 to cycle back around. Easy peasy. Now let's just make sure it works. Okay, so I'm starting with my yellow one because in my create event, I believe my selected weapon value was 1. And if I right click, yeah, look at that. Easy. Cool. If it's not working for you, once again, just kind of go back and watch carefully. This line right here is probably the most important if you're getting an error. But yeah, so if this is working for you, then this is going to work for you for any length at all of your weapon list. So you could have 10 weapons and it'll cycle through them easy. Okay, so I'm going to clear my workspace really quick. And after this, we're going to move on to our first basic enemy. Okay, wait. Sorry. I forgot something. Well, not really I forgot something, but I was planning to do something in the next video while we were talking about the enemies and how they get damaged and all that stuff. And then I kind of realized it probably wasn't a very good idea to do that in that video. It makes way more sense to just go in this video with the rest of the stuff. So really quickly, we are going to make a shotgun style weapon. Yeah. Now this is one, I figure most people who make a top-down shooter probably want a weapon that can shoot multiple projectiles at once and have different spreads and stuff like that. Plus we just did all that work on this system, so it'd be a shame to not kind of show off how easy it is to add more stuff to it. So yeah, there's that. And like spread weapons will be pretty integral to going over the stuff in calculating damage for the enemies and the player. It'll be really important to show something off. Since this video is all about the weapons anyways, let's just do it right here. So shouldn't take too long. Do the same thing we did with the previous one. So you need to make a weapon sprite and a sprite for the weapon bullet. So I'm going to do that real quick. Okay, so I just went simple again, just made a red version of the rod, and I made this tiny sort of spinning red thing. Why are the frames doubled here? What? Okay, I don't know. Anyways, so yeah, I made this tiny little thing. Make sure you get your collision mask right with your projectile object, and make sure you get your mask right for the end, for the length of your weapon. And now we need to make the bullet behavior. So let's create an object for my red bullet. Select the correct sprite like last time. And its parent is also going to be the blue bullet, just like how the yellow bullet was. And just like in the yellow bullet, we're going to inherit the create event of the blue bullet. I'm going to show its event, just see what I want to edit. So I think I'm going to keep the speed the same, but I want the distance to be short since this is going to be like a shotgun sort of thing. I want it to have a pretty close range. And so the number that I picked for that is a max distance of 48. Remember, you can tweak any of these things how you want. But yeah. Okay, so let's go back into our weapon creation script and make my red rod. So red rod, gonna be a new create weapon. Separate these out like this and just fill it out how you would the other ones. Okay, so I've filled out the right sprite, the correct length, the correct bullet type, and for the cooldown, I picked about 16. Again, you can change these how you want. So let's go back into the player and go back into the create event. And I'll just go ahead and also add in our new red rod to the list of weapons that we have as well. And so now our 0 entry is blue, 1 entry is yellow, and our 2 entry is red. So let's just start with our red, test the game, make sure we set up everything the way we want to. Okay, so it's working, and now I can swap between all 3 and they loop through. Okay, but so this is not how a shotgun works. It does not shoot one tiny piddly little bullet. The range is okay, I think, as far as a video game goes, but you normally want to shoot multiple ones out, and you want them to fan out and spread out at a certain angle. Especially when you're making a video game, that could be true of any kind of weapon you want to make. It doesn't have to be stuff rooted in, like, you know, is it a shotgun? My character uses a magic staff. It could just be some weird, crazy spell that just floods the screen with projectiles. So let's edit our system just a tiny little bit to include number of bullets we want to be shot and the spread of said bullets. So here's how we're going to do that. Okay, so we need 2 more parameters for all of our weapons, and that would be number of bullets to be shot and the spread. So let's go do that in our weapon creation, and we are going to mess with our create weapon struct. I'm just going to totally maximize this right now because it's going to get pretty big. So let's just add 2 more arguments here. So I'm going to say underscore bullet num for number of bullets, and our default will be 1. And then we can also add the spread of the bullets. And I'm just going to start this off as 0 degrees because it won't really change anything if we're only using 1 bullet. So 0 degrees is fine. We'll only ever be entering that information as long as we have more than 1 bullet anyways. And so now we need to actually add those variables. So I'll just call it bullet num like this, and we'll call the other one spread like this. So cool. I'm just going to close that really quick. So if you look on screen right here now, this is one of the weapons doing a 90-degree spread. So you can see it makes like a right angle. Then here's half of that, so here's a 45-degree spread, and here is a 22.5-degree spread, which is half of that again. Here's one that's a little bit bigger than 90, some random number that's really small. So yeah, so that's what the spread is going to be. And we're going to calculate all that in a way where it compensates for the number of bullets that we're trying to shoot. So once we have it coded, all we have to think about is the number of bullets that we want and the amount of spread. So if you want to, you can go ahead and like fill out some of this stuff for the blue rod and the yellow rod. So, you know, that'd be 1 bullet and no spread. I mean, these are the default values anyways, so you don't really need to type these in, but I'm just going to do it anyway, so that way we can play around with it a little bit once we get this all worked in. So for the red rod, I'm going to say let's do 7 bullets over a spread of 45 degrees. So this is the one we're going to be testing all this stuff with first. So now we have all this information. How are we going to use it? Well, we need to use this information whenever we create our actual shot, our actual bullet, which we do in the player object. So let's open up our player object into the step event. I'm going to go ahead and do what I did before and just region this out. I keep forgetting to do it, but end region for this just so I can collapse it all. And I'm going to go back into the shoot the weapon stuff. Okay, so first things first, creating multiple bullets instead of just 1, or at least the appropriate amount of bullets. So we're going to use a for loop for this. If you've watched a couple of my other videos, especially if you watched my menu system video, that one goes into pretty specific detail about how for loops work and what they are. There's another scenario where if you find yourself getting a little lost, pause this, open up that other video in another tab, and watch through that first because it will really explain it all. But I'll explain it really quickly here again anyways. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm separating out where we create the bullet here because we want to put this inside of the for loop as well. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to tab these out so I can make my for loop, and it's going to look like this. So we'll say for, and then we're going to open up some parentheses, and we're going to have 3 different items in this for loop. First of all, we want to set some local variable. So in this instance, we're just going to use var I standing for instance. A lot of people use I for loops like this. So var I equals 0, and then a semicolon. The semicolon is very important. So first what we're doing is we're establishing a local variable with a value. Then we're going to set a condition. So this is kind of like an if condition. So like we're going to say I is less than weapon.bullet num. So this is, like I said, this is kind of like an if. Once again, separating this with a semicolon. So we're saying if I is less than our weapon's bullet number, then we do a third thing. And what we're going to do is just add 1 to the value of I. So we'll say I++, which again is just like saying I plus equals 1. So then you're going to want to put all your code in the curly brackets like this. Make sure you're putting them in the correct place. All this stuff has to be inside. So what this is saying is it's saying for this case of things that are happening. So we're first establishing I to be 0, and then we're saying if I is less than the number of bullets that we want to create based on our weapon, then we're going to add 1 to I. And what it does is when your code is being read, it does not progress past a loop until that loop is done. So basically, so say for our shotgun weapon where our bullet num is 7, it will run this code 7 times, and each time it will add 1 to I, goes through once, I becomes 1, goes through second time, I becomes 2, goes all the way up to 7 times until I becomes 7, and then since I is not less than 7 anymore, we won't run this code in here anymore, and GameMaker can keep compiling after this. So that's why it's called a loop. Now, if you don't set up loops correctly and you accidentally set them up in a way where they don't terminate, then they will loop forever and they will freeze your game. They won't even really crash it. They'll just freeze it because your game will be stuck on the same frame forever trying to get out of this loop that you've set up. So it's important that you understand them. Hopefully my explanation here was good, but if it seems a little intimidating to you, then now is the time to pause this and go back and watch that menu system video. It probably should have popped up at the top of the screen at some point, and I will link it in the description. Okay, anyways, now moving on. So we're going to say this was create the correct number of bullets. So for our blue and yellow ones, since their bullet number is 1, it only does this loop once. So basically it doesn't even loop at all. It just plays this code in here. But if we have a higher number like 7, it'll do it 7 times. And what's cool about this, the way for loops work, is now in this little section of code, I have this I variable that is incrementing with each time it creates a new bullet, right? So just to show that off really basically, so imagine if we created it at the player's X coordinate plus its correct offset, but then we also added the I value. The first time it'd be created, it would just be created in the place where it was supposed to be, but by the time we got to the 7th one, it should be 7 pixels over. So I'll just show you that really quick. Yep, you see that? It's kind of a little hard to see, but I'll do it over the yellow. Yeah, you see how it's got this like thickness to it now? That's because we're creating 7, but they're all kind of offset by 1. And if I did that like 7 times 3, so now they should all be spaced out a good bit. Yeah, see, look at that. The first one starts where it's supposed to right here, but then they go outwards. So I'm going to take that away because that's not what I want to do. I want them to all start in the same place, but I want to influence the direction that they're moving at right here. I want that to be influenced so it can match the spread angle that we put in. So this is going to require just a little bit of math. So basically what we want to do is use our number of bullets and our spread angle to figure out how much space in terms of the direction difference needs to be in between each one of these. And then we can do what we did right there and add I and then multiply it times that difference. So here's how we do that. Let's go back outside the for loop under where we got our offsets. And first we can store our weapon spread in just a local variable because we're going to reference it just a couple times. So weapon.spread, spread. And then we want to find our spread division, and I'm just going to call it spread div. So here's where our mathematics comes in. It's pretty simple mathematics, but it's mathematics nonetheless. Plus it's not quite as simple as you might think. So obviously what we need to do is we just need to divide our spread by the number of bullets we have, right? So our weapon.bullet num. So let's just do it this way first, and I'll show you why that's not technically right, but we're pretty close to the final answer already. So now we just need to figure out how we want to alter our direction. So the easiest way to think about this is we want to take the original direction that we're aiming in, and we want to first offset that by half of our spread. So think of our original spread. So say we're shooting straight upwards, and we're shooting at 90 degrees, which is straight up. If we have a spread of multiple bullets, that 90 degrees, the direction that we're aiming is splitting our spread in half. So say our spread is just 45 degrees, like what we have here. We want the bullet on the left side going upwards, and say we have 10, 50, whatever bullets. The bullet all the way on the left, we know we want to be at a 22.5 degree difference angle going upwards, or going to the left. And then our bullet all the way on the right, we want it to be a 22.5 degree difference going to the right. And that way our spread is centered the way that we're aiming, and the two differences of the 22.5 degrees come together and make that 45 degree spread. So we're going to start all the way on that left one at that 22.5 degrees, and then we're going to add in the spread division in between each one of those until we fill out the full 45 degrees. So, like I said, first what we want to do is subtract half of our spread. So minus spread divided by 2, and then we want to add back in our spread division based on what loop we're on, so which bullet it is. And I already explained why this works, and so this is the basics of it, and this will get us pretty close to what we want. So if I run the game and shoot the weapon, look at that, it's got its own little spread. Now this looks pretty good, but you can kind of tell if I make sure that my rod is going straight up, there's actually a slight little angle difference here, and it'll be easier to show you if I change some of these values. So I'm going to change the bullet number to 3 for the red rod, and then I'm going to make the spread like 90 degrees, so a much bigger spread and only 3 of them. And now if I shoot straight up, you see that they're totally wonky. So what's happening here is just a very simple oversight in terms of the logic that we were doing with determining our spread division. So here we were dividing our spread angle by the number of bullets that we have. But we can just straight up see that whenever we do this, that's actually not the correct way we should be thinking about it. There are 3 bullets. However, if you're paying attention to the pattern, if you can imagine there's one more on the left, what this is actually doing is this is a spread for 4 bullets. You see what I mean? There's the 2 middle ones and the one on the right, and the one on the left is just missing. And that's because we shouldn't be dividing our spread angle by the number of bullets that we have, but we need to divide it by the number of spaces we have between each bullet, right? So you see here, if this were shooting straight up, this would be 3, and we're dividing it into 2 separate spaces. So all we need to do is just fix that little error in logic, which would be like this. So we want to subtract 1 from our bullet number because we will have 1 less spaces than bullets that we have. And before we run the game, just go ahead and tell you right now, this will give you an error, because remember, our blue and yellow weapons only use 1 single bullet. So 1 minus 1 would be 0, and any number divided by 0 is going to return an error, because that is not possible to do. You cannot divide by 0. So you can test that, you can run the game and check that yourself. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you how to fix it, because it's a pretty easy solution. We're going to use this simple little function called max, which allows you to put in any number of arguments that you want to, including this one right here. And what it does is max, see, any number of arguments, and then it just returns whichever one is the maximum. So in this case, we want it to either be our bullet number minus 1, or we just want it to be 1. Easy as that. So for our single bullet ones, our spread is 0 degrees, which 0 divided by 1 is just 0. So this will just shoot straight. So let's try this. Okay. Now our 3 shoot straight up, and their division has been fixed. This is a 90-degree spread that we're getting, so that's cool. And if I swapped my other ones, they're still shooting straight and fine. And now that all that is working, I'm going to change this back to 7, and I'm going to keep the 90-degree spread. But I'm also going to say maybe let's just do like a really small 20-degree spread with the yellow rod, and maybe have 3 of those. And maybe let's do something really dumb, like 120-degree spread in 2 bullets for the blue gun. So, yep, that looks like a proper shotgun. I might pull the spread down a little bit on that one to maybe about 80 degrees, but let's see. Yep, so the blue one is just shooting completely out, 2 bullets over the course of 120 degrees. And that's the yellow one now. Pretty cool. So really, the only thing that you have to program for making new guns is just the new bullet behavior. But sometimes you might not even want to change the bullet behavior. You might just want to make a straight, a child of the blue bullet and just change the sprite. You don't have to do any more programming. And all you do is just change the, the speed of it and the number of bullets in the spread. And that's it. Okay, just cutting back in on myself because I forgot to fix something. I'm sure you probably already noticed with your yellow weapon, if you're doing it the same way that I am, you'll notice that the first of your little bullets that shoots out is actually sideways. You can kind of see it there. The direction hasn't oriented itself properly with the very first bullet, or at least not the first bullet, but the first frame that it comes out. There's 2 really, really easy fixes for this, and I just sort of overlooked it, so let's talk about those really quick. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my yellow bullet, and so we set our direction in the step event. Basically what's happening is the player is creating our yellow bullet or any of our bullets in its step event, which basically means it's creating them. And since the game is on the step event for all objects, so on this game cycle, we're already doing the step event. We're kind of missing the first one for the yellow bullet. And so basically we're missing this step event for the yellow bullet, and then we're going right to the invisible draw event for the yellow bullet, which means that it's drawing at its default image angle, which is 0. So easiest fix to do this is to take out this line of code. So I just cut it out and then add it into an end step event. And so now the bullet actually has time to run that code. And so now you see that the first one is not always going sideways. So that's the easier fix. And then let's just say that because the movement direction of our yellow bullet never changes at all, it's really not necessary for us to set the image angle every single frame that this thing is on screen, right? We just need to set it whenever it's created. And it sort of stands to reason that that logic should kind of apply to into any type of bullet that has its own direction, right? That as you create it, you probably want it to be in the right direction. So we could also do this. So I'm gonna cut out that event. We don't need it anymore. And now let's open up our blue bullet, which is the parent of our yellow bullet, right? And we can add in a variable. Now you'll see that there's gonna be it's gonna look a little bit different than the one that you have right now because I'm going back and recording this, but we can add in a variable called dir fix, like this, for direction fix. And we can set it equal to false because our blue bullet, we don't actually want to change its visual orientation at all. And same goes for our red bullets. But basically in all of our bullets, we can add a variable that says, do we want to change the orientation of this when it's first created? And it'll just be a true or false variable. So it'll be false for blue. It's false for both of these right now because they're inheriting the blue code. And that means we can go into the yellow and add in direction fix to be true right here. So then we can go into our player object and we can go to the actual shooting code, which will be in our step event. And again, step event's going to look a little bit different just because I'm coming back to it at a later point. But remember, we're just going into our shoot the weapon portion of the code. Then we're coming down here where we're actually shooting the bullet, and we're already getting the correct direction. And now we can just say, turn the bullet to the correct direction at creation if necessary. And that would just basically be if our dir fix is equal to true for our bullet, then we can immediately set the image angle to be the direction that we just calculated. And so if I run the game, this will also fix that problem. Yep, so the bullets are always at the correct direction once they're created, and now we're not running extra code that we don't need to, even though it was very simple code, so it didn't matter. But those are two really, really simple ways to kind of solve that problem. So yeah, anyways, back to it. This is a crazy cool system where it's so easy to make new weapons. But one of the things that you're going to have to balance with your weapons and your bullets is damage. That's right. Now I can say that we're done with this and we can move on to making our first enemy and dealing with damage. And you'll see why it was important to include this for that, because if you want to do damaging enemies right, it takes a little cleverness. It can take a little finesse. Okay, thank you so much for watching. Like I said, we're moving on to damage next. And specifically in the next one, we're just going to do the basics of damage. And then the episode after that, we're going to go into that more nuanced stuff that I was mentioning. So yeah, remember to check out my games, especially wishlisting Star-Crossed Starcade Special on Steam. That would help me out a huge amount. If you're here and you're not subscribed by this point, you probably should be so you don't miss any parts or future videos or anything like that. So go ahead and make sure you do that, and the bell and all that. And then of course, if you want more episodes early or you want different perks, or you just want to be very cool and you want to be a gamer, check out my Patreon. And of course, you don't have to just stop at being a gamer there. You could be a star gamer. That's right. So you could be following in the footsteps of Nixionic, Red Dragon Redemption, Null, Joseph Sandlin, Midnight, Jerica Deloach, Mark, Aogio, Homeless Bums Ahoy, Scalenthrax, Captain Ludwig, and Christian Donovan. Learn from them. But seriously, again, thank you so much. Thank you so much, you guys. Thank you so much, all my other patrons, and thank you for watching. Okay, see you in the next one. Bye-bye.